what you're going to do is you're going to pass out, if you look at the next page is our excerpts from his story. And there are 10 excerpts. Now, depending on your class and how much time you want to devote a day, I've actually done this lesson in 8th grade, and in 8th grade we did it in one session. If I were teaching like 5th grade, I would break it up. I do it in 2 because they don't have the endurance. But for 8th graders, I did it in one sitting. And what you're going to do with the students is you're going to pass out this so they all have it in front of them. And then if you go back to the procedures, you can see what it is that we're going to do with them. You then do something called share read with the students. And this is a very, very important aspect. Don't cut corners on this. You will have a much greater impact if you do this the way that it's prescribed. What you're going to have the students do is you're going to have them read the document, and you're going to have them read it with you. And a lot of people, so when you have students all read together, what do we generally call that? Starts with a C, has an H, ends with an L. There's an O and an R in between. Choral reading, okay? So when you have the students all read together, we call it choral reading. But there is a problem with choral reading, a pedagogical problem, and that's this. Let's say Gloria, my friend Gloria here, let's say Gloria and I are standing next to each other, and the teacher says, okay, everyone, let's read this together. So Gloria and I start reading. The problem is that Gloria is not a very good reader, and so she doesn't know how to pronounce these words. The problem is I'm worse than she is. So since I can't read these words, who am I listening to for an example of how to read these words? Gloria, who can't read it either, all right? So the problem with choral reading is if you're having the students use as an example of how to read text, they have a very, very poor example each other. And that's the problem with complex text and using a choral reading strategy. Who is the most proficient reader in the classroom? Hopefully the teacher, okay? With any luck, it's going to be you. You are the most proficient reader in the classroom, hopefully. And so in this shared reading, the reason it's called shared reading is because you are going to share this reading with the class. And the way that this works is the teacher starts the class reading, but silently. The class is following silently. The teacher is reading aloud. And then you tell the class that you are going to call them in by, and for me, I just say class. And when I say class, everybody starts reading with me at whatever point we're at. Then, when we finish the section, we'll stop. We might discuss it a little bit, and then I'll start again, but I'll start. And they follow silently again. We use that same model as we go through the piece. Now, why? What are the advantages of doing that? Why are you doing it that way?
That you have your hopefully accurate model.
Correct. You've got they are listening to an accurate model of pronunciation. They're hearing an accurate model and look, you're modeling prosody, right? When do I stop for a period? When do I pause for a comma? When do I emphasize it because it's got an exclamation point? All of those devices for a reading strategy, you're modeling for them. So if they're not skilled, or whether they are skilled, it doesn't matter. You're still serving as that model. Unfamiliar vocabulary, they don't know how to pronounce that. Well, guess what? You're the one there that's modeling the pronunciation for words. And the thing about then why not just read it aloud to them, right? Why not just have them why have them read it out loud? Well, the reason is because they need to wrap their mouth around it. They need to experience those words. They need to be pronouncing those words. They need to be actually doing that process, and that's important. I mean, there's lots of studies you can go out and read that actually having the students read it aloud and hearing themselves say it and having their mouths wrap around it builds fluency and builds their comprehension. So and think of this, how many students have you ever known that when you're reading something aloud to them are doing this? Are they really reading? Probably not. Okay. And so by having them attend to the text and calling them in to read sections of it, what are you guaranteeing? Yeah, that they're paying attention to it. They may not understand it. They may not know how to pronounce it. They may not know, but they are paying attention to it, right? They're attending to the text. And so that's why you have them do this process. And it's an important part of having students. This is the first step in having them tackle complex text. So we're going to do that. You ready? We're going to start with part one. We're not going to do it all. Okay, I'm not going to take you through the whole thing and make you suffer through the whole thing. But actually, it's not suffering. It's actually pretty interesting. But we are going to start with some of it. So turn to Gottlieb Mittelberger. Right, everybody got it? Okay. And I'm going to start, and then I'm going to call you in, and we're going to do a few of these so you get how this works. All right. Gottlieb Mittelberger, Journey to Pennsylvania in the year 1750, excerpts. Number one. When the ships have for the last time weighed their anchors near the city of Cowes, in Old England, the real misery begins with the long voyage. For from there the ships, class, unless they have good wind, must often sail 9, 10 to 12 weeks before they reach Philadelphia. But even with the best wind, the voyage lasts 7 weeks. Number two, I'll start, I'll call you in. But during the voyage, there is on board these ships terrible misery, stench, fumes, horror, vomiting, many kinds of seasickness, fever, dysentery, headache, heat, constipation, boils, scurvy, cancer, mouth rot, and the like. Class, all of which come from old and sharply salted food and meat, also from very bad and foul water, so that many die miserably. Okay, one more. Number three. I'll start. Add to this want of provisions, hunger, thirst, frost, heat, dampness, anxiety, want, afflictions, and lamentations, together with other trouble, as CV, the lice abound so frightfully, especially on sick people, that they can be scraped off the body. Class. The misery reaches the climax when a gale rages for 2 or 3 nights and days, so that everyone believes that the ship will go to the bottom with all human beings on board. In such a visitation, the people cry and pray most piteously. All right, get the idea? So that way, you know, that's how you go through this kind of a piece with the students. All right, so we get to the end of this. Now what? All right, turn back to the procedures and let's see what we do next. So we've read the document with them. Number 3, the students will now decide which 6 events. So we've read 10 excerpts. And the students have to pick 6 events in the story that were the most important and underline those in their copy of the text. And now the way that I do this, and you'll see up above it says, students, you can have the students do this individually as partners or small groups of no more than 3 to 4 students. I always have my students work together, which is why I asked you to work together. Because what I find is that the lower students, even if you put 2 lower students together, bouncing ideas off of each other will generate synergy that they wouldn't get on their own, where they might just give up on it. Whereas if you have them work together, they're sort of forced to move forward because there's somebody else there that that's relying on them. And whereas that if you leave them to their own devices, they can just sort of fade away. But if you have them working with others, it generally works better. So after they have picked which 6 events, then you're going to have them, you pass out the graphic organizer, which is just this, next page, which is a series of 6 boxes. And these 6 boxes each have a large space, a large rectangle. In that large rectangle, they are going to draw the event. They're going to draw the event. Now, the important part about this is not the drawing. Okay, I could care less how good an artist they are. The important part about this is the next piece, is the piece underneath. So the rectangle underneath that is where they have to cite the text from which the drawing comes. Not in their own words, but in the words of the author. Because what you're looking for is, did they understand what Gottlieb is saying? Do they understand what these events are? So what you're judging is, which events did they pick? Because were they key to his story? And then the other is, does the caption that they chose match their depiction? Is what they drew, does it match what they were trying to get across? And then the final part of this is that after you've done that, is you have the students then present to the class. And so what I did was I had students working in partners, and so you would have them stand up, they would show their drawing and and then you would have the students. One student did the first three of the events, and then handed it to the other student. The other student did the next ones, and you can ask them questions. Why did you pick those? The other thing, it's fun for the students to compare with each other which ones they picked and which ones they had in common. Why did they pick a different one than the other groups, and so on. And and for the teacher, you get it's right now, did they get it or not? You don't have to wait for a test. You don't have to wait, to see if they understood what was going on in it. And like I said, you can do this in, I've had this work in 4th grade and 5th grade, but I've also used it in my 8th grade class. And, the kids enjoy it. So, yes, sir.
So on the assignment, when you give your students the direction, go find the 6 most important events, do they know what you mean by most important, or do you have to frame that? Most important to what?
Yeah, so and that's a great question. And so and they do ask that. Well, what do you mean by most important? And so I'm talking about not necessarily most interesting, okay? Because the vomiting part is interesting, right? But by most important meaning for this voyage, what was that had the most impact on whether or not on what Gottlieb Lieber is trying? What is Middleberger trying to tell us? What is he trying to say? And so what happens is that they may pick the vomiting part, but then they're as long as they can explain why that's important. So they say, well, because a lot of people got sick and it was terrible and you could die. All right, I'll buy that. That's important. Not that people got seasick, because people get seasick all the time, but that whole litany of things that could happen, to you as far as diseases and sickness and so on.
So you're not framing this in terms of, we're trying to understand the inhumanity of this. You're hoping that they will draw that conclusion, or that can be a conclusion that they will draw by the end.
Right, exactly. What you're trying to do, again, you're trying to show, not tell. Is the point. You're trying to lead the horse to water, right? But you don't want to give them intravenous feeding. And so if you can get them to recognize that I'm telling a story, and if all I can do is pick the most important things to tell the story. One way to do this is if you ask them, look, now just read those 6 pieces. Does it tell the story? Can you understand what happened? And if you can, if the narrative has a thread by putting those 6 together, then they've probably been successful. Otherwise, it's just isolated incidents, and they don't tell a story. And so that's another way to get at most important, is by, if it tells the thread of what happened, then you're probably, because if you pick, think about it, if they find the first 2 sections really cool and very right, and they drew all 6 of their panels only using those first 2, they're not going to tell the story, because the last entries talk about when you get to America and what happens about families being split up and people coming on board and buying different members of families and so on. is in the last part. Well, if they never got to that in their 6 panels, then they didn't get the thread of the narrative. And so, yeah, so that's what that's another way, is have them reread them and say, did it tell the story? Any other questions about this particular strategy for element? Yeah. No, you can ask them any question you want. Yeah.
As you're doing the share reading, if they are coming across unfamiliar terminology or references, historical references that they may not understand, are they asking questions at the moment, or is that something for them to sort out later?
The later part. So what happens is, now vocabulary is always a big issue, right? And this always comes up, is unfamiliar vocabulary. There's an exercise that, if you go to our website and look up lessons, there's an exercise that I do where I have students pull key words in order to synthesize content. And people all the time ask me, well, okay, but there are 482 words in in this document they don't know. How did they possibly understand this, how to do this, if you don't tell them what those words mean? The problem with that is that if I tell them what those words mean, think about it. You're asking them to pull keywords in order to understand text. If I tell them this is what this word, this word, this word, this word, this word, and this word means, when I ask them to pull keywords, guess which words they're going to pull? Those words, right? The words you just told them what they mean, because obviously they're so important that Mr. Bailey had to tell us what they meant. The problem is do they have control of those words? Can they use them in their writing? Can they use them in speaking? The answer is no, right? So what you do is you use what they've already got in order to build knowledge, and then on the back end, you talk about what those words mean. Because what you're trying to do is create academic independence, right? I mean, that's really what you're trying to do here. You're trying to get students to a point where you could take a piece like this and put it in front of them and have the students, without your support, go through it and figure out what it means and be able to put the narrative together themselves. Even at these grade levels, that's really what you're trying to create. You're trying to create, I mean, after all, look, the job of us as teachers is to get students to a point where they don't need us anymore. I mean, at the end of the year, when the student walks out of your class, they shouldn't need you. They should be moving to that next level, to that next person, to that next level of knowledge and understanding where you've got them to that point. So if you can give them skills and strategies that lets them be more independent, especially with difficult material, then you've done them a great service. Which brings us to our next piece. So go ahead, and I'm going to pass out this one. And this one is for secondary. So let's see if I can get, Dana, if you pass some of those out, and I'll get some of these over here. So this one deals with a couple of documents that are a couple of primary source documents that deal with the transatlantic slave trade. And I got to tell you, when I found these, one of them is a journal. You bet. One of these is a journal by a slave, an African man named Mahamo Gardo Bakuakwa. I'm sorry, butchered his name. The fascinating thing is this guy was captured in West Africa and sold to European slave traders, and he has a fascinating life story. He went to Brazil first. It was Portuguese traders who bought him. He ended up going to New York, was sold to a ship captain, ends up in New York, escapes slavery in New York, is hidden by abolitionists, taken to Boston, eventually is college educated in New York, goes to England and writes about his experience. The time period we're talking about when he wrote this, I mean, what the time period this happens is 1854. That's when he was kidnapped. Now, so I find this, and it's a fascinating piece that he writes. Well, in 1854, there was also a man who was a slave trader, who writes a memoir about his experiences as a slave trader, written in, this happens in 1854. So what we have here is an apple-to-apples account of both a slave and a slave trader, because both of them in West Africa, both of them in exactly the same year, talking about what happened. When I found this, when I was researching this and I found this, I let out a whoop down in my office at my head and went, I can't believe it, I found this. My wife came downstairs and says, what are you yelling about? And you said, you wouldn't believe it. I found this account, 1854. It's perfect. It goes side by side with something. And there's a slave trader that I found in 1854. And she looked at me and said, okay, dinner's in an hour. And just not nearly sharing my enthusiasm over this great discovery of research I'd found. So let's go ahead and take a look at how we do this with secondary students. So, overview. Over the course of 3 lessons, the students will compare and contrast 2 different perspectives regarding the transatlantic slave trade circa 1854. The comparison will be made using 2 primary source documents. One, the biography of an African man who was kidnapped into slavery, and another, an account written by a longtime slave trader. Students will use textual evidence from these 2 sources to draw their conclusions and write an argumentative essay. Objective. The students will read an abridged copy of the biography of Muhammad G. Bakakwa, a native of Zugu. This biography was written in 1854 and describes some of the events following an African man's capture and sale into slavery. Using the graphic organizer and the text of the biography, the students will analyze the events that are described and use the textual evidence to support their conclusions. Student understanding of the text will be determined during classroom discussion and by examining the graphic organizer completed by the students. Introduction. During the period of 1514 to 1866, more than 12.5 million Africans were forcefully kidnapped from their native lands and taken to America. The Middle Passage, the Africa to America leg of the triangle trade, saw well over 30,000 documented slave ship voyages that lasted from 1 to 3 months. These voyages were both brutal and dehumanizing to their human cargo. From 10 to 15% of the enslaved Africans perished from disease, mistreatment, or suicide. Muhammad Garbo Bakwaka was born in the West African town of Zugu around 1830. Though his exact date of birth is unknown. He was sold to European slave traders and taken to Brazil. Soon he was sold to a ship's captain and taken to New York, where he escaped. He found refuge with abolitionists and was taken to Boston and finally relocated to Haiti. He eventually returned to New York and attended college and published his biography. He then traveled to England, intending to return to Africa. After 1857, there was no further record of Muhammad Garbo Bakwakwa. So, take a look at the next page, which the printer cut off. Okay, so, at least on my copy, your guys' copies cut off? No, this one, the actual, is it printed for yours? Okay, I got a bad one. Hang on. That one's cut off too. Okay. Okay, so here's what you do. You got one that actually worked? Oh, good, thanks. Wow, all right, good. So what you're going to do is, this is the piece you're going to be using. These are excerpts from his journal that you're going to use with your class. Look at the procedures part, and it says you're going to put them in small groups again. And you're going to discuss the information in the introduction, that little biography that we read. You're going to talk about that with your students, that this is who this guy was, this is the experience that he had. Then you're going to pass this out to the students, because this is what you're going to use to have them analyze. And again, you're going to share read this with them, because there's going to be a lot of unfamiliar vocabulary. There's going to be a lot of this that's going to be difficult for them to read. So you're going to share read this piece with them. Then they're going to look at these chunks. Now, one of the reasons, why do you think that you chunk the text rather than giving them the whole text at one piece? Why not just give them the whole thing? Yeah, it's just less intimidating, right? If you give a student a piece of text, no matter how difficult the text is, but it's only this big, then they'll try it. If you hand them the whole thing at once and put it in front of them, what's their first reaction? Yeah, like, okay, forget it. I'm not gonna do it. I'm not even gonna try it. Okay, but if you'll give it to them in bite-sized chunks, they're much more likely to be willing to tackle it. So you give it broken up like this, chunked up, and then what you're going to have them do is you're going to have them determine the key events that happen in this. So you want them to look at it as a story. That's what it is. He's telling you a story. And you want the students to, just like with the other one, where they're picking, you want them to pick out what the key events are as they occur. So, and then you're going to copy it into the box over here. So what I have the students do is, as a group, they're going to read this, we're going to read this chunk. And then the students are going to decide what are the key things that happened. What are the key events that happened? And they're going to highlight those or underline them. And then as a group or as partners, they're going to discuss, okay, which were the most important ones? And they're going to put it over here in their own words. But, and this is the key again, just like with the other one with the caption, those own words must be backed up by citing the text and writing it underneath what they say happened. Let me give you an example. So let's say in this first chunk, okay, let's read the first chunk so that you know what it says, and then you can see what I mean. All right, so look at the first chunk. It starts with, we were 2 nights and 1 day on the river. We were 2 nights and 1 day on this river, when we came to a very beautiful place, the name of which I do not remember. We did not remain here very long, but as soon as the slaves were all collected together and the sea ready to sail, we lost no time in putting to sea. Whilst at this place, the slaves were all put into a pen and placed with our backs to the fire, and ordered not to look about us, and to ensure obedience, a man was placed in front with a whip in his hand, ready to strike the first who should dare to disobey orders. Another man went round with a hot iron, and branded us the way they would the heads of barrels, or any other inanimate goods or merchandise. Class. When all were ready to go aboard, we were chained together and tied with ropes round about our necks, and were thus drawn down to the seashore. The ship was lying some distance off. I had never seen a ship before, and my idea of it was that it was some object of worship to the white man. I imagined that we were all to be slaughtered and were being led here for that purpose. I felt alarm for my safety, and despondency had almost taken sole possession of me. All right. From that, the students have to pick what are the key events that happened in that chunk. So they might pick something like, I gave an example over here. For example, the students might write, quote, the slaves were locked in a cage and branded. Okay. And then, to support that statement, the students would cite the passage by writing, quote, the slaves were all put into a pen and branded us the same as they would the heads of barrels. So there are several skills that you're addressing here, right? Summarizing, being able to pull the main idea, or and then being able to use the evidence from the text to support that summary or conclusion. Yes, ma'am.
Do you get the main sense of how many key points there should be? Some will write 1 or 2, and others will write 15.
Yeah, exactly. The space kind of makes, so if they fit it in there. So usually what happens is you'll get like 3, and that's about right. That's generally because that the box itself will kind of script that for you. And what else will happen is, because of the box, what will happen is they won't just restate the whole thing. They won't just give it the whole thing back to you, which of course is a habit that many of our students have. And so this kind of forces that to, pick just the key things and cite them. Yes, sir.
A variant of the earlier question, what's a key event? Is it something that can be visualized?
Again, I'll leave a lot of that to the student's interpretation. And very much similar to the last one is that if it moves the narrative along, if it tells us what's important things that happened, being branded, that's pretty important. That's being locked in a pen is pretty important to the whole experience of slavery. And the kids really in general they're pretty good at that. They get, oh, this was important. This sounds important. Yes. Yeah, exactly. Especially in this kind of form where you're talking about a story form, a narrative form. Then they put what's the action that happened is as important. Especially when you use the word event, because event is action, right? What is an event that occurred? So they're going to be looking at something that happened. Yeah. So this is what I would like you to do right now. We're going to take like 4 minutes, but I do want you to try this. Take a look at the next one. Captain, now, lesson 2 is exactly like lesson 1, so I don't have to go through it with you. It's exactly the same format. It's just using a different document. This one is Captain Connaught, or 20 Years of an African Slaver. His memoir is fascinating because the one thing that he does in it is, I love his, in the introduction I talk about a little bit to his story, but he says, he wrote this, he says, his memoir is a telling of not only his life and many adventures, but of the racist attitude prevalent during the day. Of his memoir, he writes, quote, "My object in writing this palliative description is not to explicate the slavers or their commerce, but to correct those exaggerated stories which have so long been current in regard as to the usual voyage of a trader." And so he's not apologizing for being a slave trader. He's merely saying that it's not as bad as everybody says it is. And so what I would like you to do is take a look at the first box. Okay, just like we did with the slaves narrative, look at the first box, read through that, talk to the person next to you and say, okay, what are the key events? And again, as she pointed out, you're only going to be able to pick out 2 or 3 that you're going to be able to write about in this box over here. So, go ahead and do that. And we're going to take like 4 minutes, so go ahead. So here's what we're going to do. I know I didn't give you nearly enough time, but that's okay. But I want to ask for somebody some conclusions you may have drawn. What is a key event that you found that you would pull and cite for it? What's something you would have pulled out of this? Yeah.
The 2 things our group talked about was the alleged cruelties. The kind of this is, I'm going to set the story straight, and then kind of the technique of the process. Right? Here's the step-by-step process.
Right.
And then we pulled certain examples of that out.
Excellent. Yes, sir.
It's kind of a very could be kind of a guideline to good capitalistic management. You want to make sure that you're selecting only quality goods here, and there's going to be absolutely no quarrel over who owns what because of this very careful inventory and branding process.
Very good. Very good.
This is top right up.
As you know, if any of you, when you're researching your lessons and stuff, I couldn't believe the absolute corollaries between these 2 things from the same year. I was like, okay, so this is like divine intervention for me to find these 2 pieces that were told this story so well together that you could compare the 2. So you go through this and you do the same thing, right? Through all 4 of these chunks, and you have the students do exactly what we're talking about. Pull the, what the key, what's your supporting evidence? What was the key event, right? You get to the end, and lesson 3, if we turn to the last one, is they're going to take what they have learned from lessons 1 and 2, and now they're going to apply it. And in that, what they're going to use is this basic T-chart on the back. And all you're going to have them do are list the similarities and differences between the two. And you're going to have, and these two pieces work perfectly together because they parallel so much, each other so much, but with stark contrasts between the two of how they're being told. And so the students can see that, yeah, event-wise, they line up. You know, I mean, they say, this is what happened, this is what happened. Okay, that's the same. But wow, the way they're interpreted by these two different storytellers is, and that's the point you want to get the students to, that we're not arguing about what happened, right? Both of these men agree, but their interpretation of how it happened, and the pathos you can hear, or the lack of it behind the voice as it's telling the story, is something you want the students to recognize. And so the question, now I leave this open to the teacher. You can ask them whatever question you want. You can I mean, I think that your point about good capitalism is, you know, depending on the class you're teaching, right? If you're teaching an AP class, or you're teaching whatever level you're teaching, you bring in whatever question that these documents are going to get at for you. However, one that I suggested, just because I wanted to throw a suggestion in, is that if you look at the procedures, number 4, I say the students will write an essay to a prompt created by the teacher, or that answers this question: how are the racist views held by many in 1854 both illustrated and challenged by these documents? Because what the interesting thing about this is a lot of students, especially your AP students or higher level students, will say, wait. So the importation of slaves ended in 1808. So what's this all about? This is 1854. Okay, obviously it didn't end. It just went a different route. So the slave trade, instead of going straight to America, went through countries that still practice slavery, such as Brazil, and then slaves were brought into New York like he was, by a captain. And so slaves were still coming into America, maybe not the rate they had previously, but it was still happening. Any questions about this particular technique? I know we blew through it quickly, but is there anything else about this strategy? Yeah, Joe.
Do any of your students carry dictionaries and sort of like whip it out and try to look up the word? Do you understand?
No, they don't, because that's like way too much work. So instead, they know that we're going to address vocabulary, because it's always it's at the end process. So after we go through these, right, and we pull what are key events and so on, I tell them, and I forgot to put this, I'm sorry I didn't put it in there, it's in the other lessons. If you go online, I give suggestions on vocabulary, but one of the things that they do is I say, put them on the back of the sheet or highlight them. If you think it's a really important word that you don't understand and nobody in your group does either, that's the other reason to put them in groups, because there's a video that you can of me using these techniques. One of the things you see in it is one of the students saying, "Candidate, what's a candidate?" And the other kid says, what's like like somebody running for president. And he goes, oh, yeah, okay. So having kids in groups where they can bounce off each other is also something to do. But if nobody in the group knows it and they think it's important, then I have them put it on the back, and then after the exercise at the end of class, then we'll discuss it and say, okay, which ones did you guys pick out that you thought were important and nobody knew it?
So they're going to have a real challenge.
Oh yeah, and they're gonna. And the thing is you forget it. I tell them, look, there's going to be times you're going to run into words you just don't know, and you can't stop and look everyone up unless you determine it's so important that I need to know it, because I can't understand what this chunk means without it. Well, those are the ones I want you to underline, because those are the ones that are so important that we do need to talk about them. We do need to find the definition for it, but we do it at the end of the exercise. Yes. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
It seems that this would lend itself very nicely to a flip classroom, that you could record yourself reading the primary sources, and then it takes 5 to 10 minutes, and then go into the question right away.
I haven't. That's an interesting idea. Yeah.
Is the candidate chart so that they use for evaluation for
The online, like I said, this I just created for this particular workshop. As the stuff gets put up on our website, they're all in PDFs. Is how they've been done. Yeah. Peter.
I was going to say, conditions vary to your socioeconomic group. In my classroom, I know for a fact, and I don't even fight it anymore, I'll start to hear them ask Siri what the heck something means. And I'll start to make jokes. Okay, well, there's Siri going off, but don't take too much time. Write it down and keep going. So it just depends the environment that you're in.
It's true, and it depends on what you'll allow. The problem that I have with dictionaries or say Siri is that the students will present that they'll say, well, this. The problem is that if they don't use the word, if they don't have enough experience with it, they don't have control of it, they misuse it. I don't know how about you, but I've had students write essays with 25-cent words that have absolutely nothing to do with what they thought they were trying to say. So vocabulary, again, is a huge stumbling block, but it is also a big opportunity when you show them that you can work with what you've already got and we can just build on it. Okay, thank you very much, and I'll turn my time over.